How did Apple first see Siri?
So that's a funny story too, because I told you there's some really interesting demos that we had along the way. Easily the worst demo we ever gave was to Apple.
Really?
I mean, it was on a day where our speech partner at the time, which is not the one that we had ended up using, they had a bad day. I was saying, get me a table for two at this restaurant, and it was coming back saying, the circus is in town. I mean, it was so ridiculously off. And I'm looking at my co-founder, what the hell is going on here? And the people around the table are kind of going, yeah, this is really not that good. and at the time we didn't have any big plans, but it was just terrible. So we actually quickly made a video because it started working again. They had fixed whatever the issue was. And we made a video showing it working.
What a day to have a bug.
Yeah, exactly. But it was the only time that we had that. And I'll tell you a few other stories. But we made a video that showed it working and what happens when it does work. And that evidently had gone like wildfire around Apple. So that was their first look, and evidently people had forwarded that on. And ultimately, after we launched, a bunch of people ran to Steve and said, you got to see this. So,
and when does it go from this is cool to the courtship begins?
When Steve decides.
Yeah. How did that start for you?
I got a call out of the blue about 3 weeks after we launched, and actually it was a call to my biz dev guy, and he said, Scott Forstall from Apple wants to talk to you. Can I give him your phone number? I'm like, sure.
Yeah.
And my phone rang, and it was funny because I picked up my phone and I'm like trying to swipe. It kept on bouncing back. You guys ever have that problem? It bounced back like 7 times before I finally answered the phone, and it was, hey, is this Dag? Yeah. This is Steve Jobs. And I said, really? But I could hear, it's funny because I could hear that it was him. I knew it was him right away because he has a distinctive voice. And it was cool. I don't get really nervous in those type of situations very often. And
so what's he say?
He says, we love what you're doing, and where exactly you guys located, and how big's the company, and we're really excited about what you're up to, and like to see more. Can you come over to my house tomorrow? I said,
what'd you say?
I said, actually, I'm taking my wife to the ballet, so this is the truth. I did. I said, yes. I said, I'm happy to come over, but I'm taking my wife to the ballet. He said, oh, that's great. He said, we'll set up a time a little bit earlier. He said, I'll call you back in a little while. Literally. And so, an hour later, phone rings. It's him. And then he said, okay, I found a time that's going to work earlier. Come on over. Gave me directions, verbally to his house, and literally like, well, then you take off, at 280, and then you get off in this, Like, I could just put it in my iPhone, Steve. So anyway, went over there. Of course, I brought my co-founders with me, and you just go up, and he's got a really small, normal-looking house, and not small, but it doesn't stand out on the block. And walk into the front door, and there was sort of a guy there that, just in a black T-shirt, kind of looked like a special forces kind of guy. Hello, come on in. And I ended up just sitting down in front of the fireplace with him and chatting for about 3 hours about the future of mobile and what Siri does. And he basically told me the story of how Apple's going to win mobile. And we talked a lot. And he told me some inside stuff that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but unless you give me a couple more sips of that. But it was interesting, and I found it quite surreal sitting in there next to him talking 24 hours after he called the first time. So that's not the typical startup story, but I guess it means you're doing something right.
So you leave that day, and are you thinking partnership, sale?
Well, I mean, I was under no illusion that he just heard about me and thought I was a really nice guy. They were interested, I think, and he alluded, in a few ways that they were interested, and he called it throwing in together, because we can do some great stuff together. And so, that was sort of the beginning of the courtship, and we had probably 30, 35 phone calls. It was always he and I one-on-one. And of course, my VCs had heard about that, and they're like, what's going on here? We just raised a bunch of money. We had like $15 million in the bank or more. We weren't ready to sell. But Steve was just very persistent, and the negotiations kind of got to a certain point that it became interesting.
What can you tell us about the process of selling a company to Steve Jobs, and about your story and how it worked? Given that your VCs had just put money in, I mean, they weren't ready to sell.
So it was an interesting story because we didn't want to sell. But ultimately, when it was clear that, anyone that works on an idea that you think is really transformative wants to see their baby go big, right? And it was a pretty irresistible proposition to work personally with, the most influential guy in the history of technology, the most influential technology company at the height of their influence, to take your thing and make it something big. So that really weighed into our consideration. And he personally was obviously going to be involved because it was a personal interest of he and Scott Forstall were both really into this stuff. They just hadn't figured out how to put it together yet. So at a certain point in our discussions, we were talking to the board. Of course, they knew that we were having discussions, and we had decided that we were interested in making the move. And
was it quick? Was it?
No,
we're done.
No, it took some time. And I don't want to get into all the details about it, but there was some back and forth there, and it covered a few weeks.
So what's working with Steve like? You spent some time then at Apple.
Yeah.
What is it working with Steve Jobs? I mean, what a rare experience.
It's a lot like what you hear. He was very respectful with us. He was nothing but great with us. I mean, he clearly has a weak spot in his heart for entrepreneurs. And we ended up talking. He was sort of tutoring me on how to handle my own board of directors in midnight calls. And, I've been in your shoes 3 different times, and you've got, more power than you think you do. And so VCs, remember that. The founders have the power. Just remember that. So he was very straightforward with us. There was a couple of funny episodes in there. He had just gone through they were going to buy a company called AdMob. I don't know if you remember that company or not.
I do. As I remember it, they were about to buy it. And
there's a little story there. I think, he was working with the founder, and they had a no-shop clause, and, this is public information. You can read the story. But
I remember hearing Larry Page came in within hours of the no-shop ending.
Yeah, exactly. So Google had swooped in and ripped, took this company out from underneath them within a day or two after this expired, and so he was very sensitive to that. And I had mentioned in part of our negotiation about changing the length of our no-shop clause, and he had just gone through this other episode, and I was talking to another very high-ranking guy at Apple, and I told him that I wanted to change that, and he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, I think that's reasonable if we're going to close in this time period." And anyway, I got it within 30 seconds. My phone rang, and it was Steve. He must have been in the room. It was that fast. He's like, "Wait, I'm wondering what's going on." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, you wanted to change this thing." And I said, "Yeah, I think it's good that we align this thing with this date with this other date." And he said, No. I could feel he was just not happy with that whole thing. And so he was I felt the rage. And ultimately it worked out, and he said, sometimes we'll disagree. It's okay. He's kind of getting himself calmed down. But anyway.
And how much did you work with Steve after he closed while you were still at Apple?
Regularly. He was very involved in, the design and deciding.
And talk about the kind of things he would weigh in on, the time he would spend with you guys what did he want to focus on? What was his role and contribution, and how it interacted? Because you're working with a legend at the peak of his game.
Right. What was clear working with him is that he knew what he wanted. He would certainly be open to change his mind, which was legendary. He would change his mind on things, but when you're advocating a different position than his, you'd better be right. Mm-hmm. And he kind of demanded that of people, and that's what makes Apple, is that there's such a high standard of excellence there. And if you don't have a good perspective on the product, you're not in the room. And that's basically how the hierarchy had worked at that point, was that if you had something interesting to say or had a perspective, you were there, and if you weren't, you weren't. So that was sort of that was the way Apple worked. And Steve, he had a good idea on how he wanted to use it, and you see exactly what he did. And